I have been many things: a daughter, a wife, a mother, a widow. I have been called strong by people who meant it as a compliment and didn't understand what it cost me to become that way. I am 82 years old. People visit me now and see a harmless old woman winding down peacefully toward her end. They are kind to me. I don't fault them for what they cannot see. What they cannot see is what I carry. There is one thing I have never spoken aloud in 66 years. It has sat at the center of my chest since the autumn of 1867, cold, heavy, permanent. I have smiled over it, gone to church over it, raised children over it, done everything a woman was supposed to do while carrying this one thing I was never allowed to put down, never permitted to speak of, never given so much as a single afternoon to grieve. Nobody warned me. They just told me to be a good girl. And I was. I was a very good girl. And it destroyed me anyway. You cannot prepare someone for that kind of loss. Not the kind that comes from death or fate, but from another person's deliberate choice. The moment you understand, with horrible clarity, that you were weighed against something else and found to matter less. That what you felt was looked at and called irrelevant. You cannot prepare a young girl for the moment she realizes she is not a person to the people who own her. She is a thing to be arranged. I was born in April of 1851. My mother always said the redbuds were blooming when I came into the world, that the hillside behind our farmhouse was covered in them, pink against the last of the winter gray, and she took it as a sign. Said it meant I would be a person of feeling, a person who would love deeply and be loved deeply in return. She was half right about that. We lived in Tennessee, a small valley in the Cumberland Mountains, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody and had known their parents and grandparents before them, where the same families had farmed the same ridges for 3 and 4 generations, where your name told people everything they thought they needed to know about you before you opened your mouth. We were Hargraves. My father's people had been in that valley since before his grandfather's time. That meant something. That was a weight you carried, in the good ways and the bad. My father farmed 50 acres, corn and tobacco, with a kitchen garden my mother kept that produced more than we needed, so she preserved and traded the surplus. He was not a wealthy man, but he was a substantial one. People respected him. He served on the church board, was called on to help settle disputes between neighbors, was the kind of man other men came to when they needed advice. He was not tall, but he had a presence, a gravity. When he walked into a room, it changed. When he spoke, people listened. When he was silent, people wondered what the silence meant and tried to behave in ways that would make the silence a good one. He loved his children. I believe that. I have spent 66 years turning that belief over in my hands like a stone, examining it from every angle, and I still believe it. He loved us. He worked himself to bone and sinew for us. He prayed for us every night on his knees beside the bed. We could hear him through the walls, naming each of us by name. He was not an affectionate man, didn't hug or say tender things, but we knew. The way you know a fire is warm without having to touch it, you just know. And yet. Mother was different from him in almost every way. Where he was granite, she was water. Not weak. None of the women I knew were weak, they couldn't afford it. But yielding where he was fixed. She moved through the world gently, sang while she worked, old hymns in the morning, mountain songs at noon, made up melodies in the evening that had no words and no name and belonged only to her kitchen and her hands and the particular slant of the late light through the window. She held things carefully, vegetables from the garden, a cup of tea, my face in her hands when I was small and had been crying. She held everything like it was worth holding. She never warned me about what fathers could do. I've thought about that for decades. Whether she knew and couldn't find the words, whether she had her own story she was keeping folded up small inside herself, whether she saw what was coming and was helpless to stop it, and chose silence over the cruelty of telling me what she couldn't change? I don't know. I'll never know. She's been gone 30 years and she took her reasons with her. I had an older brother, Robert, steady and serious, made of the same material as father. A younger brother, James, who laughed at everything and got into trouble for it. A little sister, Ellen, 5 years younger, who followed me through childhood like a small, devoted shadow and is the only one of my siblings still living. We were not a family that spoke about feelings. Feelings were private. Feelings were your own business. You had them, and you managed them, and you did not burden other people with them. That was the teaching. I absorbed it completely. It became the architecture of my whole life. I don't blame them for what they taught me. They taught me what they knew, what had kept them upright, what the world had taught them. The problem was that what kept you upright could also keep you trapped. The same walls that held the roof up kept the windows from opening. I didn't know that when I was young. I only understood it later, much later, when it was far too late to do anything about it. His name was Thomas Calloway. He came into our valley in the spring of 1866, when I was 15, going on 16. He'd come from Kentucky with his uncle to work the season at a neighboring farm, the Hendersons, 2 miles over the eastern ridge. I saw him for the first time at the June church social on a Saturday evening when the air was warm and the fireflies were just beginning, and someone had brought 3 kinds of pie and set them on a long table under the elm trees. He was 18, not the tallest young man there, not the loudest, not the one throwing his energy around the way young men do when they want to be noticed. He stood a little apart from the others, watching things, not shyly, not hiding, just watching with a quality of attention that was different from ordinary looking. Like he was actually thinking about what he saw, like the world was something worth paying careful attention to. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead when he moved, brown eyes that were serious until he smiled, and when he smiled, they changed completely, became younger, became something that made you want to know what he was thinking. He spoke to me first, asked if I'd tried the blackberry preserves at the end of the table. A small thing. A nothing thing. But the way he asked it, turning to look at me directly, waiting for my actual answer, not just filling silence with a question he didn't care about, made me feel something I hadn't felt before. Like I was a person someone was genuinely interested in. Like my opinion about blackberry preserves was information he actually wanted. I told him they were too sweet. He laughed. Said he'd thought exactly the same thing but hadn't wanted to say so in case it seemed ungrateful. Said most things people worked hard to make and called good were really just sweet things in disguise, and that real goodness was more complicated than sweetness. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I felt the truth of it somewhere underneath the understanding, the way you can feel a note of music before you can name it. We talked for 2 hours that evening. Stood at the edge of the gathering while the light went down and the fireflies came up and the children ran through the dark between the lanterns, and we talked about everything and nothing, about the valley and what he thought of it compared to Kentucky, about books. He had read more than most young men I knew and wasn't embarrassed about it, about whether the summer would be a wet one or a dry one, about what he wanted to do with his life, about what I thought about things, which was the part that astonished me most. He asked what I thought, and then he listened to my answer, not waiting for his turn to talk, actually listening. No one had ever listened to me like that, not as though I were a child to be managed or a girl to be entertained, as though I were a mind worth engaging. I walked home that night beside my sister Ellen, who chattered all the way about who was wearing what and who had spoken to whom, and I barely heard a word she said. I was still in that conversation, still turning it over, holding it up to the last of the light, trying to keep it from fading. He found reasons to be on our road after that, would pass by on his way somewhere and stop to talk if I was at the well or in the garden. Came to the next church social and the one after. My mother saw it and smiled at me in the kitchen one morning with a look that was all knowing and no words. My brother Robert told me to be careful. James teased me until I threatened to put salt in his coffee. I ignored them all. I was somewhere beyond the reach of caution by then. By midsummer, we had found ways to speak privately, brief stolen minutes at the edges of social occasions. A half hour in the Hendersons' lower field one evening, when I was bringing something to their house and he happened to be working nearby, which I later understood was not entirely accidental. He told me things about himself in those conversations. About his father who had died of a fever when Thomas was 16. About the weight of being the oldest son and what that required. About the land he wanted someday, not borrowed or inherited, but earned, his own. About books he had read and places he wanted to see, and the particular way he thought about justice, which was careful and complicated, and nothing like the simple version most people settled for. And he asked about me, not politely, not as conversation filler. He asked about me the way someone asks when they are genuinely building a picture of another person, adding detail to detail, returning to things I'd mentioned weeks before to ask what had become of them. I had never been the subject of that kind of attention before. Didn't know what to do with it at first. Then understood, slowly, that this was what it felt like to be known. Not needed, not managed, not assessed. Known. By August, I was in love with him. I didn't have experience with the word at that point. Didn't know how to name what I felt with any confidence. I just knew the world had a different quality when I knew I would see him soon. That the days between were a waiting I could barely stand. That something in me was completely awake in a way it had never been awake before, and that the thought of that aliveness going away was the most frightening thought I had ever had. I believed, because I was 15 and had never been told otherwise, that love was a kind of permission, that the universe did not put that degree of feeling into a person's chest and then take it away, that the strength of what you felt was a measure of its rightfulness, that God or fate or whatever ordered these things would not be so cruel as to make you capable of loving someone that completely and then refuse to let you keep them. I was wrong about that. I understand now that the universe is completely indifferent to the depth of what you feel, that your love is not a vote, that it counts for nothing in the ledger of what actually happens to you. That is the hardest lesson I have ever learned, and I learned it before I was 17 years old. Thomas went to my father in September of 1866. Went formally, the way a young man was supposed to. Dressed in his best clothes, came on a Sunday after church, asked to speak privately. I didn't know he was going to do it. He hadn't told me, probably because he knew I would be afraid, and he didn't want me carrying fear in my body before there was any reason to. That was the kind of person he was. He thought about other people's experiences. He paid attention to what things cost. He told my father his intentions were honorable, that he wanted to court me properly, with marriage in view once he had established himself. He had savings, not much, but some. He had a job offer for the following spring at a sawmill in the next county that paid good wages. He had a plan. He was 18 years old, and he had stood in front of my serious, granite-faced father and laid his whole plan out plain, every piece of it, and asked for permission to pursue his daughter. My father said no. Thomas told me about it that evening, found a moment when we could speak privately before he left, and told me quietly and carefully the way he did everything. His face was controlled in the way it got when he was keeping something very difficult inside. He told me what my father had said, that Thomas was a decent enough young man, but had not yet established himself, that a girl's future needed more than intentions and a sawmill job, that he had another situation in mind for me. He used those words, another situation, as if I were a problem to be solved, as if the question of my life was a practical one with a practical answer, and the answer was not going to be Thomas. I went to my father that same evening. I had never challenged him directly before, had never pushed against his decisions. But this was different. This was the center of my life, and he was moving it without asking me, and I couldn't simply accept that. I went to him in the front room where he was reading, and I stood before him, and I spoke. Not crying, not pleading. Clearly. I told him Thomas was a good man, that I believed in him, that I had feelings for him that were serious and not childish and worth considering. I said everything I could think to say, made every argument I had. He listened. He let me finish. He was not unkind about it. He did not dismiss me rudely or lose his temper. He just said, quietly and finally, that he appreciated that I had feelings in the matter, but that a young woman's feelings at 15 were not a reliable guide to what she would need at 35, that he was thinking of my welfare and my security and my future, that I would understand his reasoning when I was older, that I would be grateful someday. He was so certain, so completely certain that he was right, and that his certainty was a form of love. That is the thing that has haunted me longest. Not cruelty, certainty. He looked at me standing there with my whole heart in my face, and he saw a child who didn't yet understand the world, and he felt tenderness for my ignorance, and he made his decision and stood behind it, and there was nothing in his face that suggested he considered, even for a moment, that he might be wrong. I went to the room I shared with Ellen and lay down beside her sleeping form and put my face into the pillow and cried without making any sound at all. I had learned that from years of living in that house, how to cry without being heard, how to grieve quietly, how to feel enormous things in a very small space. I cried until I was empty, and then I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought, another situation. I thought about those two words for a long time, tried to imagine what they meant, what my father had already arranged without telling me, what my life was going to become. 3 weeks later, I found out. His name was Harlan Moore. He was 34 years old. He owned a farm in the next county, a proper farm, 200 acres of good bottom land, a solid house, a barn, livestock, 2 horses. He had been married before. His first wife, a woman named Ida, had died 2 years earlier in childbed, along with the baby. He was a widower who needed a wife, someone to keep his house and give him children and manage the domestic side of the farm. My father had heard of him through a man at church. A transaction was arranged. I didn't know any of this was happening. That is the thing I come back to still. All of that was decided and discussed and settled. All of it. My life, my future, my body, the person I would lie beside for the rest of my days. And not one moment of it was put before me. Not one person said, "What do you think? Is this acceptable to you? Does this match what you want from your life?" Nothing. I was informed, not consulted, presented with a conclusion, not invited into the deliberation. I was 16 years old, and my future was already decided, and all that remained was for me to be shown to the man who had agreed to take me. I met Harlan Moore on a Sunday afternoon in October. Mother dressed me carefully that morning, put me in my good blue dress, did my hair the way she knew I liked it. Her hands were gentle, but her face was doing something complicated that I couldn't quite name. Something sealed and sad behind the ordinary care of it. She touched my cheek before we went out to meet him. Just her hand on my face for a moment, warm and soft, and then she looked away without saying anything. He was not what I had braced myself for. I had spent 3 weeks imagining something terrible, some old or brutal or repellent man that I could hate cleanly and completely, something that would make my refusal simple and righteous. But Harlan Moore was ordinary. Middle height, broad-shouldered, a plain, decent face, work-roughened hands, a calm way of moving. He was polite to me, asked sensible questions. Was I comfortable with farm work? Had I kept house before? Was I in good health? He nodded at my answers carefully, the way a man nods who is making sure he is getting accurate information, who takes the practical details seriously. He wasn't unkind. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't leering or frightening or inappropriate in any visible way. He was simply a man who needed something and had come to get it, and was being a careful and considerate customer about the whole transaction. That was the worst part, I think, that there was nothing to point to, no visible wrong being done, just a system operating exactly as it was designed to operate, quietly and efficiently, turning a girl into a solution to a man's domestic problem, and everyone in that room, including my mother, treating it as the most natural thing in the world. I wanted to scream. I did not scream. I answered his questions. I was polite. I was what I had been trained to be, a good girl. I saw Thomas one final time, the Sunday after I met Harlan Moore at church. He must have heard. Word moved fast in a valley that small, and something in his face told me he already knew. He was across the churchyard when I saw him, standing with his uncle, and for a moment our eyes met and held, and everything that had ever passed between us again in that single instant. All of it, the church socials and the stolen conversations and the fireflies, and the way he listened. The whole of what we had been to each other, and the whole of what we were about to lose. I could see his pain from 20 feet away, could see him keeping it still, keeping it in, the way I had learned to keep things in, and I thought with a grief that had no bottom. He learned that from watching me. He left the valley before the first frost. Went to Virginia, someone said, or perhaps Kentucky. Nobody spoke of it to me directly. He was simply gone one day, like a season that had ended, like weather that had passed. The world closed over the space he had occupied and looked exactly the same from the outside, and I walked through that unchanged world, carrying the understanding that a thing can be completely destroyed and leave no visible mark on its surroundings. Nobody asked how I felt about any of it, not once. I married Harlan Moore in February of 1867. I was 16 years old. The ceremony was held in the church on a Wednesday because the preacher was only available midweek that month. It was cold, a thin, mean February cold that found every gap in your clothing and settled into your bones. A small gathering, my family, a few neighbors, a cousin of Harlan's who had ridden 2 days to be there. I wore my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit me, cream-colored wool gone slightly yellow with age. I stood beside Harlan Moore and repeated the words I was given to repeat and felt nothing, not grief, not dread, not resignation, nothing. I had sealed everything up so tightly in the weeks before that I had gone somewhere beyond feeling. It was the only way I knew to survive it. You go somewhere inside yourself that is very small and very quiet, and you let the outside world do what it's going to do, and you don't feel it touching you. I had learned that trick young, and I used it that day, and it worked. The ride to Harlan's farm afterward was 2 hours in a wagon in the February cold. He talked some about the farm, what needed doing in the spring, what the house was like, where I would find things. Practical information delivered practically. He wasn't unkind about it. He wasn't cold. He was just a man who had married a wife and was now bringing her home and explaining the arrangement. I listened and nodded and watched the frozen fields go past and thought about nothing. Made myself think about nothing. The house was solid, better than I'd expected. 2 stories, 4 rooms down and 2 up, properly chinked, a cast iron stove in the kitchen that heated the room well. Harlan had cleaned before I came, swept, put fresh ticking on the bed, stocked the pantry. He had made a genuine effort. I could see that. He had wanted me to walk in and feel that he had prepared a decent place for me. And it was decent. By every practical measure, it was more than decent. But it was not mine. That is the only way I know to say it. I walked through every room of that house and touched the furniture and the walls and the shelves and felt not one thing that belonged to me. Every choice in it had been made by someone else. The woman before me, or Harlan, or time and circumstance. I was standing inside a life that had been assembled for someone else, and now I was being inserted into it, and expected to fill the shape. Harlan was not cruel to me in the marriage. I want to say that plainly because it matters and because I will not tell an untruth even to make my story simpler. He did not beat me, did not demean me or mock me or take pleasure in my unhappiness. He provided well: food, clothing, firewood, a sound house. He worked brutally hard. He fixed what broke without complaining. He was faithful, as far as I knew, which was more than some women had. He was, by the measures his time and place used to judge such things, a good husband. But he did not know me. He never tried to know me, not in the way that matters. He was not interested in what I thought about things, not interested in whether I was happy or unhappy beyond the practical measure of whether I was functioning, not interested in my interior life at all, really. In the world behind my face, the things I thought about in the dark, the way I felt about books or seasons, or the particular color of the sky before a storm. He noticed when the meals weren't ready. He noticed when the house was poorly kept. He did not notice me. He noticed the service I provided. There is a difference between those two things as large as the distance between stars, and I lived inside that distance for 28 years. Thomas had noticed me. That is the thing I could never stop coming back to. Thomas had asked what I thought about things, and then thought about my answers, had remembered what I'd said 3 weeks ago, and asked follow-up questions, had looked at me like I was a mind attached to a face, not just a face with a body underneath it that could cook and sew and produce children. The contrast between those two kinds of being seen, the contrast between being known and merely being needed, was something I felt every single day of my married life. Not loudly, not in a way that broke me, but steadily. Like water finding its way through stone, I gave Harlan 5 children. Clara first, in January of 1868, a girl who came into my arms in the dark of a winter morning and immediately did something to me I hadn't expected. Cracked open the sealed place, let something real flood back in. I loved Clara with a fierceness that frightened me by its intensity. Loved her not with duty or habit, but with something raw and ungovernable. She hadn't chosen any of this either. Hadn't chosen her mother or her father or the circumstances of her making. She had just arrived, small and perfect and bewildered, and needed someone to hold her. I held her. And something in me that had been performing became real again because she required reality. She would not accept performance. I thought about Thomas the morning Clara was born, lying in the early light with her in my arms, exhausted and torn and more alive than I had felt in a year. I thought about where he was, whether he had found someone who had chosen him freely, whether he was building the life he had described to me in those stolen summer conversations. Whether he ever thought about a valley in Tennessee and a girl who had told him blackberry preserves were too sweet. I hoped he had built something good. The hoping hurt, but not hoping would have hurt more. The years went by the way years do when you are very busy and not entirely present. George came in 1869, then William in 1871, then Nell in 1874, then Samuel in 1877, who nearly killed me coming into the world and left me weak for months afterward. 5 children in 10 years. My body was a machine for the production of life and the maintenance of a household, and it ran that machine faithfully and well and at considerable cost to everything else. Harlan aged hard. By the time I was 30 and he was 48, he was already an old man in the ways that showed, stooped from work, weathered from sun and wind, hands so calloused they felt like bark when they touched you. He was not unkind to the children. He was distant with them the way he was distant with me. Present, providing, recognizably their father, but not there in the ways that made a child feel entirely known. George and William grew up to be men like him, capable, quiet, providing. Clara grew up to be careful, which is what women become when they have learned early that the world does not give them much margin. I recognized what I had made of her, and grieved it silently, and loved her more for having had to build that caution, that cost. There were nights, many hundreds of nights over those 28 years, when I lay beside Harlan's sleeping form in the dark and let myself think about Thomas. Let myself imagine, just for those few minutes before sleep, the life that had not happened. The farm somewhere that he would have worked himself. The house we would have chosen together, not walked into already made. The evenings of talking, really talking, the way we had talked in that valley in the summer of 1866, about things that mattered, about ideas and futures, and what we thought was true. Mornings where someone looked at me across the breakfast table and actually saw me looking back. I always stopped myself before the imagining went too deep. That way lay a sorrow I couldn't afford. You cannot run a farm and raise 5 children and be a proper wife on borrowed time if you spend too much of yourself grieving what isn't there. So I would let myself have just a moment of it and then close it away again and go to sleep. That is the discipline of the life I had. That is what I had been trained to do. Fold it small, put it away. Get up in the morning and do what needed doing. Harlan died in October of 1895. He was 62 years old. He was working the lower field on a clear fall morning, and his heart stopped. George found him lying between the furrows with his face turned toward the sky. He had been dead some hours. The doctor said it was fast, said he likely felt nothing. I stood at his graveside and felt grief. Real grief. Not performed grief, not the right kind of grief for public viewing, but actual grief. For what he had been, for the life he had lived, for the decency he had shown in his ordinary, unimaginative way. And underneath the grief, a layer of something I could not name to anyone. Not relief exactly, not joy, something more complicated. The recognition that I had spent 28 years being someone's wife and had never once, in all that time, been fully known. And now I was a widow and would never be fully known by him. And the window on that particular life was closed. There was grief in that too. Grief for the knowing that had never happened. Grief for his sake as much as mine. That he had lived beside me all those years and never understood there was a whole other person behind the wife he thought he knew. He hadn't deserved that. It wasn't his fault he'd been chosen and had never been the one doing the choosing. The crime had happened somewhere else. He was just the man my father had decided to solve a problem with. I had spent years resenting him for that, quietly, in the way you resent a wall that was built around you without consult. Not the wall's fault, but it still keeps you in. He was a good man. That is the full truth of it. A limited man. A man who never looked past the surface of things because he had never been taught there was anything worth finding underneath. But good. I buried him and cried for him and meant it. My father lived to 78. He died in the spring of 1901, in his own bed, with his children around him, the way he would have wanted. I traveled 2 days to be there at his end, sat beside him and held his hand through the last of it. He looked at me near the end, with those grave, serious eyes that had always made me feel I was being assessed and found adequate. I wonder sometimes what he saw when he looked at me then. Whether he knew, in those final hours when some people seemed to see more clearly than they could before, whether he understood what he had done. Whether the understanding had come to him on some ordinary evening in the years between, looking at his daughter, at the capable, dutiful woman she had become, and feeling, just for a moment, the faintest shadow of a suspicion that capable and dutiful and happy were not the same thing. He never said. Not in 34 years after my marriage did he ever ask me directly if I was content. Never acknowledged the boy he had turned away. Never said in any form that there was something to forgive, which would at least have been an acknowledgement that a wrong had been done. He just treated me as he always had, with a kind of steady approval, as though I were an arrangement that had come out as planned, as though the outcome had justified the method. I held his hand while he died. I did not pull away. I am his daughter, and I loved him, and those things were true at the same time as everything else that was true, and I was never able to reduce it to one feeling or the other. That is the real complexity of it. The thing they don't put in the simple stories. You can be wronged by someone you love. You can forgive them without being healed by the forgiving. You can sit at their deathbed and hold their hand and mean it, and still carry the wound they gave you into every day of your life until the day you die. Both things, fully, at the same time. My mother died the year before him. She went more slowly, weeks in bed, fading by degrees, the way a lamp dims before it goes out. I came and stayed with her. We talked more in those weeks than we had talked in perhaps my entire life. The approach of her end had loosened something in her, made the things she'd kept sealed feel less worth keeping. She told me, one afternoon in early spring with the window open and the smell of the greening world coming in, about a young man she had loved before she married my father. She didn't give me his name, didn't tell me the whole of it, just the edges, the shape of what had been and what had been prevented and what it had cost her. She looked at the window while she talked. Not at me. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when they have been keeping something steady for a very long time and are only releasing it now because there is no longer enough time left to make the keeping worthwhile. I held her hand and said nothing. What could I have said? That I knew? That she had passed this thing to me without meaning to? This particular damage? This particular silence? The way you pass a face or a way of walking? That I had spent 30 years carrying the same weight she had spent 50 years carrying, and that neither of us had ever told the other, and that we had sat in the same rooms and eaten at the same table, and been bound by the same blood and the same silence, and never once said the true thing to each other? She died on a Tuesday morning in May. The red buds were blooming again on the hillside. She would have said it meant something. I sat beside her and thought, this is where it ends. This is where I take the thing she handed me, this sealed, folded, carefully maintained grief, and I decide whether I'm going to pass it on the same way she did, or whether I'm going to be the one who finally puts it down. I did not put it down. I am still carrying it, but at least I am carrying it with my eyes open now. I am 82 years old. I have outlived my husband and 2 of my children and all of the people who were present in that valley in the summer of 1866. Outlived the Hendersons and their farm. Outlived most of what I knew. The valley itself has changed. New families, new houses, a road that didn't used to be there. The elm trees from the church social are gone. The church itself burned and was rebuilt smaller. The particular world that formed me is gone as thoroughly as if it had never existed. And yet I am still here, the last vessel of it, still carrying things that have nowhere else to go. My children are grown and gone their own ways. Clara is 65 years old, which seems impossible, and lives 20 miles away and visits on Sundays when the weather is good. She has her careful, capable face and her sealed interior and her love for her own children that is fierce in the way mine was fierce for her. I look at her and I see myself, and I feel a grief that I cannot explain to her and would not try to. She has made a better life than I did, I think. Married a man who at least sometimes asks what she thinks about things, has fewer children, has slightly more room to be herself. The world has changed enough for that. Not enough, but some. George and William are decent men their father would have recognized. Nell married well and moved to the city and writes letters that are cheerful and full of news about her children and tell me very little about herself. Samuel, my youngest, died of fever at 32, and that grief I will not speak of. There are losses you describe and losses you only carry. I think about Thomas sometimes still, less than I used to, with less of the sharp edges that used to make it catch on everything. It has worn smooth over the years, the way something sharp wears smooth when you carry it long enough. He would be 82 years old if he lived. I do not know if he lived. I never heard his name spoken again after he left that valley. He went somewhere and built whatever life he was going to build, and I went somewhere and built whatever life I was going to build, and there is a whole world between those two lives that was never made. Children who were never born, conversations that were never had, an old man and an old woman sitting somewhere in their old age who would never be us. The young women I see now, when they come to visit with their husbands and their babies, when they stand at the edge of church socials with that particular look on their faces, that awake, entirely occupied look that I know as well as I know my own face in a mirror. I want to speak to them, want to pull them aside and say, that feeling you have right now is real. It is not childish or unreliable or something that will look different when you are older. It is the realest thing in you at this moment, and it is worth fighting for. Do not let anyone call it a feeling in a tone that means it doesn't count. Do not let anyone weigh it against land and livestock and find it wanting. Do not let anyone fold it up small and put it away on your behalf and call that protection. But I don't say it. I haven't said it in 66 years, and I am not able to say it now. Some silences become structural. They hold up too much of the edifice of your life to be safely removed. You take them out, and too many other things fall down. So I smile at the young women and admire their babies and tell them they are lucky, which they are, and I carry my silence home and set it down beside me and sit with it in the evening, this old companion, this familiar weight. Sometimes I am angry still, not often, and not the hot anger of the young, but something cooler and quieter and more considered. Angry that I was not given a choice. Angry that no one in that entire valley, in all those years, looked at what was done to me and called it what it was. Angry that my mother knew and couldn't speak, and my father decided and felt righteous, and Thomas left and built another life, and I was left to make something out of what remained. Angry that the something I made was, by most measures, good. That I raised decent children and kept a decent home and was a decent person. Because the goodness of it is so often used as evidence that the thing that was done to me wasn't so terrible after all. Look how it turned out. Look how capable she became. Yes, look, that is what the destruction of a young woman's first love looks like from the outside 66 years later. It looks like an old woman in a good dress, sitting in a clean house with photographs of her grandchildren on the mantel. It doesn't look like anything. That's the whole point. That's what we learn to do with it. Make it invisible. Make it look like nothing happened. Perform the outcome so convincingly that everyone, including sometimes yourself, forgets there was a cost. If I could go back, if I could stand in that Cumberland Valley in the summer of 1866 and speak to the girl I was, the girl standing at the edge of a church social with a cup of something sweet in her hand, about to turn and see a young man with dark hair standing a little apart from the others, I would say this. I would say all of it. I would not spare her any of it. I would say, what you are about to feel is real. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The world is going to spend a great deal of effort trying to tell you that what you feel at 16 is not reliable, that you are too young to know your own heart, that a girl's emotions are weather, passing and unpredictable, and not to be trusted with important decisions. Do not believe that. You know your heart. You know what is true in it. The people who will try to override it do not know your heart better than you do. They only have more power. Those are not the same thing. Power and wisdom are not the same thing. I would say, fight. I know you don't know how. I know you have been raised to bend, to defer, to call the bending grace and the deferring duty. I know the idea of standing before your father and saying no, plainly and finally, feels like something outside the boundaries of the possible. But it is not outside the possible. It is only outside the permitted, and those are different things. What is permitted and what is right are not always the same thing, and sometimes the most important act of your life is choosing right over permitted and bearing the consequences. I would say, Your father loves you. Remember that, and don't let it be used against you. His love is real, and his decision is wrong, and both things can be true at once. You can love someone completely, and still refuse to let their love become the cage that holds you. Love is not permission to own a person, not a father's love for a daughter, not any love for anyone. Love that demands your life in exchange for itself is not the whole of love. It is missing something crucial, and you are allowed to name what it is missing. I would say, if he forces this, if you cannot stop what is coming, survive it. Build what you can build inside the life you are given. Love your children with everything you have. Find the moments of real beauty and hold on to them. They will be there, scattered through, genuine. You will not be entirely lost, but know what was taken from you. Don't let them convince you that nothing was taken. Don't let the capable woman you become be used as proof that the girl you were didn't matter. She mattered. She matters still. I am still her, under everything. Still the girl at the church social in June who turned and saw a young man standing apart from the others and felt something wake up in her that had never been awake before.